¿Estás? Gracias a todos por estar aquí. Esta conversación se va a desarrollar en inglés. Sonamaco está muy feliz de tener esta conversación entre Bob Colacello, quien trabajó de cerca con Andy Warhol desde los años 70, y Eugenio López Alonso, presidente de la Fundación Jumex Arte Contemporáneo, quien hace posible este programa de conferencias. Muchísimas gracias and welcome.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm so honored to do an interview or to ask someone who lived history and who sometimes history has been changed by words in books, and sometimes they're not accurate at all. Everything, but having Bob Colacello here in Mexico City, it is not only an honor, it will be you will learn a lot from someone who's been known to be accurate and who lived it all. Bob, first of all, an applause for Bob Colacello, who's here with us today. And
Thank you.
And I want to ask you, how did we start? We started with, how did everything started between you and Andy, and the fact, how did you were introduced? I know the story, but can you tell them all?
Yeah, well, in 1970, I was at Columbia University Film School. I was 22 years old, and I was writing some film reviews for the Village Voice, which was like the hot cultural newspaper then. And one day I got a call from a person who was working with Andy Warhol, and he said that Andy had been reading my film reviews and wanted to meet me because he started a new magazine called Interview, which was mostly about film when it started. And my very sort of bourgeois parents on Long Island were shocked and said, you know, you cannot even meet with this man, because Andy had a very radical, avant-garde, even slightly pornographic image. His films were very controversial. But of course I couldn't wait to go and meet him. And I started writing for Interview, and within a matter of a few months, Andy decided I should be the editor, Andy and Paul Morrissey, who directed his films. And I was like, I don't know how to edit a magazine. But that was part of the genius of Andy, that he hired people very young, and he let you learn on the job. In a way, we were experimenting with how could you make a different kind of magazine. And then I was there for 13 years.
How was that first interview with Andy? The first time you saw him, where was it?
It was at 33 Union Square West, which was where the second factory, the silver factory, the first factory, was in the East 40s. And then Andy moved to Union Square. He was actually shot at that factory, almost assassinated by Valerie Solanas. When I went to meet him, they had you got off on the 6th floor, and it was a small building, and there was a bulletproof door with a little window, and you pressed the bell, and Andy was sitting at this Art Deco desk right in front of the door, and he buzzed me in, and he said, "Oh, hi, oh, gee, I like the way you write, would you like some lunch?" And he was eating puree of spinach and puree of carrots, because after his shooting, his insides were all torn up, and for many years he could only eat very soft food. But I was like, I can't believe this. Andy Warhol's offering to share his lunch with me, because my idols, like so many of my generation, were like Mick Jagger, William Burroughs, and Andy Warhol. I mean, I became interested in art as a teenager, seeing Andy's paintings in magazines of Elvis and Marilyn, because those were the start. You know, I went to every Elvis Presley movie with my sisters. Everyone, you know, Andy from the beginning. I think it's important to, in a very simple way, to remind people that pop art is popular art, and that Andy's images are so accessible. You know, everyone knows what Campbell soup is, knows what a dollar sign is.
When do you think it was he started with Bergdorf Goodman on the window shopping, and But when was his turning point into 1959 or 60? That's when he started, no?
1961, 62 is when he gave up. Andy had gone to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he was from. He came to New York in 1949, and he was really a graphic designer and fashion illustrator. He quickly became the most famous in that field, and very, he made a lot of money for the 1950s. But by I would say 60, 61, he realized that, he wanted to be famous more than anything. And he realized you didn't become really famous being a fashion illustrator. You had to be an artist. Jackson Pollock had become really famous. Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, who also decorated store windows to make money with Andy, they had left that and they were now becoming famous as real artists. So Andy was going crazy. What can I do to be part of this new pop art movement, to show in galleries and become famous? Fame was always a goal for Andy, and maybe even more than making money or not to say he didn't love making art, but so he was trying to figure out what to do. He did some cartoon paintings of Little Orphan Annie and famous cartoons in America, Superman, and Leo Castelli Gallery was the pop art gallery. His assistant came to see these paintings, and he said, Andy, there's a guy in New Jersey, Roy Lichtenstein. He's doing much better cartoons. Forget the cartoons. You have to have another idea.
That was Ivan Karp?
Ivan Karp. So Andy had a friend named Muriel Resnick. She was sort of an art world groupie. And they were having dinner one night. He said, Muriel, what can I paint? What can I paint? She said, give me $50 and I'll tell you what to paint. And $50 was a fairly good, like $500 in 1961. And she said, look, Andy, paint something so common, so ordinary, that no one even looks at it twice, like Campbell's soup cans. And Andy said, oh, that's a great idea. And she said, now I'll give you another idea for free. Paint what you love the most. And he said, what's that? She said, money. So the next day, Andy, he hadn't discovered silkscreen yet. He started doing these hand paintings of $100 bills and of soup cans, all different size canvases. And Ivan Karp from Leo Castelli Gallery came back and still said he didn't want to give Andy a show. But he brought along Irving Blum from Los Angeles, who owned the Ferris Gallery, which was the leading avant-garde gallery in Los Angeles. And Irving loved the Campbell soup paintings. Andy had done all 32 varieties by hand, and Irving gave him a show, and a supermarket down the street filled the window with Campbell soup cans, real cans, and put a sign, the real thing for 39 cents. Andy's paintings were selling for $100. And Andy very cleverly went down to the supermarket with the photographer and posed in front of that sign, that window, with he had the white wig already, black leather jacket, and that picture went out over the wire services, and newspapers always had like a little space to fill, on some pages, and that picture, a lot of newspapers ran it because it was like, is this guy nuts? He's painting Campbell soup cans and trying to sell them for $100? Meanwhile, so that was the beginning of the fame thing.
Was that his first gallery show, right?
First
ever,
gallery show.
1962.
Yeah, and Irving
on La Ciénaga,
only sold 3 of the 32 paintings, 1 to Dennis Hopper, and Irving thought, this is silly to let 3 paintings go. He bought them back, kept the whole 32, the set, and sold it to MoMA about 5-6 years ago for $15 million. It's probably worth $250 million now, the 32. But that's how it started. And then
what from Irving told me was that he only sold 3 paintings.
Right.
And he said, well, to sell 3 paintings, I think I should keep it as a set.
Yeah.
So he paid back, or maybe he had not been even paid, but he decided to keep it as a set. And Andy said to him, Well, that was my idea, to keep everything as I said. Is that true?
I think it would be true. I didn't know Andy then. But Andy loved the idea of multiples. Coming out of advertising, a big element of advertising is repetition. And so everything Andy did was series and, the same image in different colors. When he did his commissioned portraits, a collector would come and say, I'd like my wife's portrait done, and he'd do it in pink and blue and green.
The factory existed there? No.
Well, Andy, again, he understood branding before people even used that word. So to be a pop artist, he would say in interviews, oh, I don't do my own work, my assistants do it. But that really wasn't true. He and Gerard Malanger, his first assistant, the big paintings, he discovered silk screening. They would run, they would slide the silk screen because it was big. But Andy did almost all his own work.
And then the movies, when he started the films, were a little bit 64, 60.
Yeah.
I mean, when Kennedy was shot, he was not fascinated, he was in shock by what happened.
The whole country was in shock when Kennedy was shot.
When Marilyn died in August of 1962, then Jackie was a widow in November 1963. And Liz they were the three most famous women in America,
and Liz
right?
almost died from having the tracheotomy, and Cleopatra was the biggest disaster of all time. I think, a part of Andy's work, or one interpretation of Andy's work that has not been explored enough, is his relationship to Catholicism. Andy was not a Roman Catholic, he was Byzantine Rite Catholic. His family came from Slovakia, and he went to a church called St. John Chrysostom, Greek, Russian Catholic Church. They recognized the Pope, but the Mass, everything was Greek style, Russian style. And he grew up going to church to 3 Masses on Sunday with his mother, 2-hour-long Masses. So for 6 hours, he was looking at the iconostasis, the grid of the saints, very flat, gold leaf background. And I think Andy's paintings of Marilyn, Liz, Elvis, Jackie, he was really making icons for our secular culture. These are the people we worship, and they were all martyrs in a sense, which is a very Catholic thing.
He loved money, like you said. That's when the money started. He was making money. Yeah. That's when he started selling. There was like a group of people, followers.
Well, especially, it's not so much in New York, yes, not so much in the rest of America. In Germany and Switzerland and Italy, the Tate had a retrospective in 1970. The British critics said Andy was the Matisse of acrylics. He had much more serious acceptance there. But he did start making some good money. And I think to Andy's credit, what did he do? He started making experimental films, which cost money. So he was really financing his filmmaking from the paintings. And then when he started Interview Magazine in '69, he started doing the commissioned portraits where society people, celebrities would commission Andy to paint their portrait for $25,000 each. And that money was what financed Interview and then all of Andy's video experiments. So, and the more money he made, also the more young people he hired. So the factory was really, we were all very fortunate looking back on that to be able to be apprentices, to the way the Renaissance artists work, to a great artist and learn so much and have the opportunity to explore our own creativity. Although in the end, everything was Andy's,
And Fred Hughes came into the picture since the very beginning?
No, 1967.
You say Fred Hughes was a major part of Andy's?
Yes. Fred Hughes was an art student from Houston, Texas, where the leading art collectors were Jean and Dominique Dumenil. They came from France. They owned a company called Schlumberger Oil Equipment, which they moved to Houston when Hitler invaded France. And they were big art collectors, and they financed Rice University's art department, where Fred was studying. And they realized that Fred Hughes had this incredible eye, this incredible natural taste. And they got him a job at Yolis Gallery in Paris. They introduced him to Andy. And Fred, again, Andy decided to hire him just like that. And Fred said, you shouldn't be exclusive with Leo Castelli. He's not really selling that much of your art. He's still favoring Jasper Johns and Roy Lichtenstein. I'll be your manager, and you'll work independently of all the galleries, which I think Andy was the first artist to work that way. And Fred, somehow they got to know Bruno Bischofberger, the leading contemporary art dealer in Zurich, and Bruno bought a lot of 60s work. He also started lining up commissioned portraits in Europe. Fred got Mrs. Dumenil to do her portrait, then Nelson Rockefeller, and then Yves Saint Laurent. So once you got these very prominent, serious people to commission a portrait from Andy, then everybody else followed.
Okay, so now we're talking about Interview magazine.
Okay.
Interview started as an idea. They called you to be the leadership. You took it. You started.
I took it over after about 6 issues. There's many stories. Andy would tell different stories why he started Interview magazine. One was he wanted to get free passes to movie screenings. Another was he was jealous that Rolling Stone, which was on newsprint, and Screw magazine, the sex magazine, they were selling a lot of magazines. They were on cheap newsprint. He thought, why can't I do a cheap magazine like this? And another was one of his superstars was called Bridget Berlin. She's in Chelsea Girl. She's in many films. Her father was named Richard E. Berlin. He was the chairman of the Hearst Corporation, the most powerful newspaper and magazine company in America then. Very right-wing. And she was big rebel. So he said he started Interview for Bridget because he thought if her father could be such a successful publisher, Bridget could be a successful publisher. I think he started it for all those reasons, but really basically because Andy, he never was satisfied just being a painter. He wanted to be a filmmaker. Then he wanted to be a magazine publisher. Then he wanted to be a video maker. Every new technology Andy started exploring. He had tremendous creativity, and he was, in a sense, a good businessman in that he was able to bring in young people who had fresh ideas, but also were open to his ideas, and delegate. He didn't lean over my shoulder every day saying, what are you putting in the new issue of Interview?
Never.
No, I would show him the issue when it came out, and he would go through it, and he would count the pages of advertising. And he would say, 44 pages. How many did we have last month? And then he might comment on, he'd ask how a certain cover sold. But he had given me some rules right in the beginning. Make every photograph big, no type on photographs, only tape recording, no writing, because tape recording was more modern. So I was given basic guidelines. But otherwise, we all liked the same things anyway.
But Andy was visual, no? He always said visual, bigger photographs. He believed in that, no?
Yeah,
that people didn't want to read.
Well, he believed in photography when people didn't really think photography was art. His paintings were criticized for being silk-screened photographs. A lot of people said it's not really a painting.
How long it took Interview magazine to become? Like a year later, it was.
No,
it was a monthly magazine. 1 month.
Monthly.
Monthly.
I would say it was about 74, 75. And what happened is after like a year, Andy started, and Fred Hughes wanted me to travel with them to Europe because they realized I could talk to anybody, so I could help sell the art. So I was traveling so much that it was hard to also be running the magazine on a day-to-day basis. So I had my assistant, Glenn O'Brien, who also had gone to Columbia, take over, and then that became a problem. He fought with Fred, he fought with Paul Morrissey, and then we brought in another editor from Williamsburg Daily, another disaster. So finally in 75, they made me in charge of everything again, and at that point it started growing very rapidly because we sort of knew what we were doing. We knew the mistakes we made. And I was willing, Peter Brandt was an investor. I was brought up Italian-American strict family. You listen to the boss. The problem was we had like 5 bosses. We had Peter Brandt, Andy Warhol, Fred Hughes, Paul Morrison. But I figured out they each wanted one thing. If I did that one thing, everything else I could do what I wanted. But there wasn't a problem because we all thought it was great to do a Death in Venice special issue. We all thought it was great to put Jerry Hall on the cover or Mick Jagger on the cover or Marisa Berenson. Most of the covers were people who were friends of Andy's. The advantage Interview had is that Andy was like a magnet for people in film, people in art, people in society, even sports. And we would have lunches at the factory, you know, and it could be Marie Helena Rothschild and Iman and John McEnroe and some beautiful young girl who's starting out modeling, some handsome young guy, just a whole mix-up. Larry Rivers would come by, or Roy and Dorothy Lichtenstein. And we would just ask people, oh, can we tape record you and put you on the next cover of Interview?
So it was.
It was very organic.
But Vanity Fair, for instance, Vanity Fair in the last 20 years, they had the star of the moment, or someone. This is the formula, more or less, that Andy had, or people who were not.
With Tina Brown, when she took over Vanity Fair, and I was hired by Leo Lerman, but she said to me how influenced she had been by Interview at Tatler, and she was always saying the mix, the mix, the mix. Andy just naturally, this mix of people happened. We would put Jack Nicholson on the cover. He was a big star. He was also a friend. We wouldn't put Dustin Hoffman on the cover because he wasn't really glamorous, you know, Dustin Hoffman. But he was glamour was like the key element. We were criticized a lot for being superficial. And Fred Hughes once gave an interview, he said, yes, we are superficial. We are deeply superficial. And that became like our slogan. But Interview was more, it wasn't really journalism, it was more like a documentary where you were tape recording famous people, and a lot of people we discovered. We were the first to even do a photograph of Prince, let's say. But we would just really run the tape. And the readers felt like they were there in the dining room or in the restaurant with Andy talking to Mick Jagger or Nureyev or
Farrah Fawcett,
who
was
Cher,
the big thing, yes.
or Diana Ross, we had a lot. It was a mix of pop culture, sort of society, but fashion. I mean, we had Halston. We did Diana Vreeland was like this icon. She was in her 70s, former editor of Vogue. She was the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. No magazine would put her on the cover. They said old people didn't sell. We didn't think that way. She was a friend. She had great things to say. Young people flocked to her. Her cover was a big success. We had Nancy Reagan on the cover. Half the art world didn't talk to me again because they were all Democrats. But, you know, she was the first lady. And she thought it was good her people thought, put her on Interview, it'll show she's not so cold and stiff and middle, bourgeois. And we had a lot of fun.
For how many years Interview magazine existed? How many years? Since 1969 till?
Well, I left in 1983, but Interview still exists.
But no, under your...
I was there 13 years.
13 years.
And I also helped Andy write his philosophy book. A lot of the photos I took became his photos. When you worked with Andy, the great thing is he was really open to your ideas. Like he would ask me, should I put cow wallpaper up at my Whitney retrospective? And I said, yeah, it would look really Baroque with the paintings on top of it. He was like, oh, Baroque, what a great word. So you felt good that this major, huge, hugely famous artist was taking you seriously. At the same time, he was taking everything you had and making it his. But you know what? It was a great education. It was a lot of fun.
And in his art, in his paintings, every artist has bodies of works, no? Their body of works.
Series,
Their series. And with Andy, how many series you would divide it on? In the 80s was a lot, no? It was...
Well, after he was shot in 68, he didn't do any real paintings for 4 years. He just did a few commissioned portraits. He'd stopped making films. He turned it over to Paul Morrissey. He was exhausted. He had almost died. When his comeback series were the Mao paintings. He did 4 huge 20-foot-high Mao paintings and like 10 medium, 20 smaller, and 100 little postage stamp. And then he was back. He did Hammer and Sickles. He did the Drag Queens. He did the Skulls. I mean, all these great series, the dollar signs. It was just one after another. And you'd come to work, and it was so interesting to see what Andy was going to do next. And the way he got his ideas, He had done a series of drag queen paintings called Ladies and Gentlemen, transvestites. And they were shown in Italy in Ferrara at the Palazzo di Diamante. Again, the Europeans got these things more than Americans. And Italy was in the middle 70s going through a very communist phase. All the intellectuals were communists. And so there was a press conference and they kept asking Andy, but tell us the truth. You painted, all the drag queens were blacks and Latinos. That's what this art dealer commissioned wanted. And they said, what you're really saying is that these African American and Hispanic American boys can't get any work, so they have to become transvestite prostitutes because of capitalism and racism. And Andy was like, well, gee, Bob, is that why I did that? He would have. So when this press conference was over, he said, they really want communist paintings in Italy. I have to do communist paintings. We go back to New York, and 2 days later, I go to work, and Andy's got Ronnie Catrone, his art assistant, has gone to the hardware store and bought real hammers and real sickles, and they're taking Polaroids of them. And these communist paintings, the first really big one was bought by Gianni Agnelli, the head of Fiat. So, I mean, it's, the way things happen there, I'm sure with any artist, it's a combination of accident, premeditation, creative inspiration.
But Andy, from what we know, he had his group of people,
right?
His friends, his intimates. You were among them,
right?
Every day you saw him, or every other day, I don't know. But who was the person who was closest to him?
Well, I would say Fred Hughes and also Jed Johnson, who was his boyfriend for many years and actually edited the films. You had to work for Andy to be really close. Bridget Berlin and he were like an old married couple. They would have these long fights.
She adored her, right?
He adored her. He would give us little paintings for Christmas and birthdays, and every time he gave Bridget a little Mao painting or whatever, flower painting, she would say, I don't like your art, I don't want your art, I need a new washer dryer. And she would give him back the painting, and he would buy a washer and dryer for her.
What about Bianca Jagger?
Well, I would say his close friends that were not in the factory.
Were not in the factory.
Okay, were Bianca Jagger in the 70s, Holston and Liza Minnelli. They were always Steve Rubell. That was the Studio 54 group. But Andy had a lot of other friends. He had his shopping friends, John Reinhold, who was a diamond dealer, Stuart Pivar, because Andy was a big collector, hoarder. Andy would rather have, I remember Bruno Bischofberger saying that he took Andy to the #1 dealer in Navajo blankets in New York. And there was one exceptional one that was $10,000. And then there were a lot that were okay, and they were $1,000 each. Andy said, I'll take 10 of the 1,000 each, rather than the one good one. And he would bring those home and keep them in the shopping bag. He just hoarded, and he was always looking for, oh gee, what's the next new category? Because he had gotten into turquoise Mexican jewelry before anyone started collecting it. Then he got into Art Deco jewelry, then Art Deco furniture, and it became a thing that when Andy Warhol started collecting something, the prices would go up. So in the end, he was collecting Bouguereau paintings with Stuart Pivar, and that's what the Saturday shopping friends. Andy was very curious about people. If he could have interviewed every person in the world and taken their picture, he would have. He was attracted to stars, but he was also attracted to just average people.
Random people on the street.
People, yeah.
They had to have something.
Yeah, he was always trying to figure out human relationships. He had said, and he sort of meant it, I want to be a machine. I don't want to have feelings. And sometimes we would have these talks, especially on trips, where you'd come. I'll tell you about coming to Mexico with him, but just in general, you'd be in a hotel suite waiting for the next appointment, and Andy would say, oh, Jed is giving me such a hard time, his boyfriend, and I would say, Andy, maybe you should show a little more affection towards Jed, He's really so nice with you, and he was like, show your feelings a little more. And he was saying, Bob, you don't understand. If I showed my feelings, I'd have a nervous breakdown. And I think he really, I believe that was true. And shall I tell you when we came to Mexico City?
That's a very important chapter, of course. course.
It was in 1972. The Italian ambassador's wife commissioned Andy to do her portrait. This was typical of how Andy in interview worked. We had met them in New York. She was an artist shown with Yola's Gallery. She was pretty good. She wasn't Max Ernst or Magritte. So she was having a show in Mexico City, and she wanted Andy to come to her opening. So Andy said, you know, she really likes you. You have. She was called Maria Luisa de Romans. And Andy said, you know, you have to pop the question. Pop the question meant ask them to have their portrait done. And if you popped the question and they said yes, you got 20% commission. So I was like kind of new at this. So I had to tell her at dinner in New York, you know, Andy wants to come to Mexico, but it would be really nice if you had your portrait done. And it's only $25,000. So she agreed to this. And she invited Andy, Fred Hughes, Jed Johnson, and me to Mexico City. We went to the opening. We stayed at the Camino Real, which was new then. Andy, of course, loved the Camino Real because it was so ultra-modern and pop in some ways, and yet very Mexican, of course. And we went out to see the pyramids. Andy refused to get out of the car. He said, it's just a pile of rocks. And we all got out of the car and climbed to the top of the pyramid where some Mexican boys were selling fake pre-Columbian statues. By the time we came back down, it was very hot. Andy's car was surrounded by all these young Mexican boys asking for money. So he was like, it was like that scene in Suddenly Last Summer with, you know, the Tennessee Williams movie. I mean, you know, the next day, like Andy would dictate his diary to me or Pat Hackett, we saw everything in a very ironic way, you know. I mean, we went to see Sigueros in Cuernavaca. Andy loved all the murals. We went to Diego Rivera's house in Coyoacan or San Anel. And in those days, quite different than today, Diego Rivera was the most famous Mexican artist, and Frida Kahlo was like a footnote. Now, of course, it's reversed, and you see how the perception of art changes with the times. But we had a very good time, and we never came back.
And tell me something. Who were from the artists, from his peers, from his artists from his own generation, the ones that he admired or he looked at? Andy really loved Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg.
Well, Andy loved Jasper Johns' work, but he felt very personally rejected and snubbed by Jasper Johns. Because Jasper was an ivory tower artist. He didn't have lots of kids coming to help him make movies. And he looked down on Andy. Like a lot of Bill Rubin, the curator of the chief curator of MoMA, who loved Jasper Johns' work, never would hang one Andy Warhol painting, even when Philip Johnson bought them for the museum.
Oh, he never hanged them?
MoMA totally rejected Andy until he died.
But they had paintings already
they had
bought,
7 paintings
purchased.
that Philip Johnson gave them over the years. Philip Johnson was a trustee of MoMA, the architect. So Andy...
So until the 80s, he was hanged.
Yeah, Andy had he owned Jasper Johns. But
Rauschenberg, he liked.
Rauschenberg was a much friendlier kind of person. He would come to the factory. He always had a couple of young guys with him who were his assistants. Larry Rivers, Andy was really close to, because Larry was more like Andy. He was kind of wild. He had a jazz band, like Andy had Velvet Underground. He had, a motorcycle. He had young girlfriends. This wasn't really done in the art world
Lichtenstein,
back then.
what about?
Roy and Dorothy Lichtenstein were great friends. Cy Twombly was a real friend. When he came from Rome, Robert Wilson was a real friend, the theater guru. And then it was really, but Andy we didn't have so many artists for lunch in the 70s. It was more movie stars, society people, the Iranian ambassador who arranged for Andy to do the portrait of the Shah, people from Carter's White House, who then Andy did Jimmy Carter's portrait. It was not so much artists, but in 1980, after critics and curators saying for 20 years that painting was dead, everything had to be, if minimalist maybe, but video, conceptual. This new generation burst out of art schools who really wanted to paint. Julian Schnabel, Eric Fischel, Francesco Clemente, Basquiat, who didn't really go to art school, Keith Haring, Kenny Scharf. And this group of new young painters all gravitated towards Andy. So suddenly, it was really nice for Andy, who was in his late 40s or 50, early 50s, to have like this circle of young artists who saw him as their idol, saw him as their influence, their model, and they didn't have this hang up about being rich and famous or about having a band or wanting to make films on the side. You know, they felt they were artists, they could do whatever they wanted, and yeah, they did want to be rich and famous. And so that was a real change in the whole atmosphere.
And they became rich and famous very fast.
Well,
no?
I mean, the artists I'm mentioning all became stars, big stars right away.
Mary Boone started representing them, and then Leo Castelli took them away.
Yeah,
No,
and also by 1980, the whole art market, the art scene, contemporary art market was growing. The auctions were getting bigger, there were more galleries, there were more younger collectors, so there was more room for more painters in a way. But, you know, I think the thing about Andy is that his curiosity about people, about how relationships worked, about politics, about the times, is what gave his art this relevance. And that is a big part of why his art is so valid still, so relevant, and more popular than ever. There are exhibitions at your museum, there are exhibitions in Uruguay and Mongolia, wherever. There are young people lining up at the Whitney for blocks at this retrospective. I heard there were big crowds at your museum too when you did the Dark Star show. By the way, I love that title because I think Andy's influence in many ways was dark rather than sunny. I mean,
that was all my idea. No, I'm kidding with you. That's nothing further from the truth. No. Everybody helped me in everything, and a great team of people. It wouldn't have been possible without them. But I want to ask you something. In the 20th century, people say that there will be two artists. That the 20th century, there will be, of course, many artists, but two artists in the 20th century that will be remembered: Picasso and Warhol. What is his... Picasso, well, we all know what he did is genius, and Warhol, he changed. What do you think? It was the 60s. It was after the Second World War, where a lot of artists immigrated to the States, and Max Ernst, many artists came, and there was a breath of fresh air of new artists coming up. I think that the Americans, after 1950 with the abstract expressionism, and then, well, needless to say, Pollock, Motherwell, and so many, and then they come the pop artists, which they hated that word, no? The pop artists. But it was Warhol the one. Why do you think he stands above?
Well, I think Picasso, in simple terms, represented the culmination of European art. I mean, his art reflected so much of whether it was Velázquez or, on and on and on. All the Picasso, and he was omnivorous. He never stopped working. Andy was clearly in competition with Picasso. When we met Paloma Picasso, his daughter, one of his daughters, Andy was grilling her, and they became good friends. How many paintings a day did your father do? How long did it take him to do it? But I think what Andy represented was the new primacy of America. Even more, the abstract expressions still were more tied to Europe, whereas pop art was a break. It really was American art. Popular culture was American. Hollywood was American. Popular culture was Americans' contribution to international culture. And but I think why Andy stood out over, let's say, Roy Lichtenstein or Rauschenberg or Johns or Wesselman, or all of whom are really important artists, was Andy went beyond art. He went into media. Andy's work was about communications, and we were going into the era of media, the era of images. You know, when Nixon was forced out of office in 1974, Congress did not vote to impeach him. The Washington Post drove him out of office. Andy was fascinated by Nixon and the whole tape recording process, but the media essentially took over. And Andy, when he said everyone will be famous for 15 minutes in 1963 in Sweden in an interview, you know, people were just starting to have tape recorders. Video cameras didn't even exist yet, let alone Instagram. And, you know, I think Andy understood, because he himself cared so much about fame. And he spent his childhood very sickly and lonely watching these Hollywood movies and writing away for signed autographs, Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. He was so immersed in fame that I mean, we have a president in the United States who's like an Andy Warhol caricature.
But he was murdered in front of cameras with Jackie crawling in the... I imagine
very important.
If Princess Diana, when she was killed on the 30th of August 1997, which was 10 years later, well, Andy died in February of 1987, Princess Diana, the whole world was in shock. I mean, everybody. And I don't want to say he enjoyed by all means, no, but it is women that, correct me if I'm mistaken, it's just a question.
Yeah.
He would have been shocked by that news, that moment, no?
Oh, I think so, yeah. He was shocked by the Kennedy assassination, and he started doing those paintings of Jackie at the funeral.
But he loved more Jackie than John Kennedy.
Yeah, because I think, and again, I think it goes back to this secular saint idea. She was the saint. She was the martyr. Yeah, how could you say that? He was the one shot, but that was the image that we saw.
That America saw.
And the pink suit with the blood stains. And she was glamorous, not that the president wasn't. It's curious why he never did a painting of Kennedy. But, you know, when O.J. Simpson, that whole thing started, there was this day where O.J. Simpson tried to escape, and he was riding on the freeways of L.A. at 20 miles an hour in really slow, and the freeways were completely cleared of cars, and there was this image, which we all watched for like 6 or 7 hours, of this car going very slowly, followed by 100 police cars. And Bridget Berlin called me up and she said, "What do you think of what we're watching on TV?" I said, "It's an Andy Warhol movie." It was like Empire, you know, I mean, one of these movies when nothing happened for like 8 hours, but yet the whole country was obsessed with watching it.
I was in Chicago that day. I had just arrived from Los Angeles to Chicago. And a friend of mine, I went to the hotel because it was the World Cup in the United States in 1994, June of 1994. And I thought they were watching a game, and everybody would say, "Look what's going on at the 405." And I thought it was some TV program. No, it was real. It was real. It was like, that moment I knew he was the murderer. Yeah. But aside from that, anything, it was something, when you see tragedies or horrible events like this, because there's nothing good about them, Andy somehow...
Well, his disaster series.
His disasters.
May I ask you a question? How did you first become interested in Warhol?
I became interested in Warhol in 1987, 1998, after he died. No, I'm lying. I didn't know about Warhol when he died. I was not into art.
You were very
Once
young,
he died, I asked who was Warhol, but I was very, very, very young. Come on. No, I was 20 years old when he died, 19. And then, as much as I was looking at Warhol, at his pieces, And then people told me, no, it's only the 60s that is worth Marilyn's, Jackie's, or Liz's, or the disasters. The disasters, I love the disaster pieces. But as time has gone by, not only because of the prices, no one knew at what point, because what do you think about the prices? I mean, you see, those were the disaster pieces, I love them very much. But I see every single piece of Warhol, and the Campbell soups, the Campbell soups.
Yeah, there's that beautiful, very simple camel soup that Alice Walton bought for her Museum of American Art for like 150 million. I mean, you have to put the prices in the context of today's art market, where Andy's one of, I think, 10 artists who sold over 250 million, a painting for over 250 million, along with Cézanne and Picasso. You know, I mean, these prices, you never could have dreamed of prices like that in the 70s for any artwork.
But Bob, you're one of the few people who's still alive, who's still perfectly clear, because you were very young when you met him, and who can tell us an accurate story. You know what I mean? It is because many, they have been gone. Bridget Berlin, she's still alive?
Bridget is. Her health isn't great. She's become even more conservative than her father. She watches Fox News 24/7. But you know, a lot of it's ironic.
How did you learn when Andy died on February 7th, 1987?
Well, he died 22nd of February.
22nd.
George Washington's birthday, which you know seems like so perfect for Andy to die on George Washington's birthday. Well, I had flown to Switzerland to visit Thomas Amann, the late art dealer, who was very, very close friend, and you know, flew all night, got a car up to Gstaad, and said, Thomas, I have to go to bed and get some sleep. And a couple of hours later, Thomas was like shaking me awake because I fell into a very deep sleep. And he said, Bob, something terrible's happened. And I was like, what? I thought I was dreaming. And he said, Andy died. Fred Hughes just called. We didn't even know Andy was in the hospital. They kept it very secret. Just Andy, Vincent Fremont, who was the vice president of his company, also very close to, and Fred, they were the only ones who knew. So, I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And I felt very guilty also because I had quit 4 years before. We stayed friendly, but, you know, I left because I wasn't happy. And, you know, I was about to sign a contract to write a book about Andy. And I thought, I'm not going to write this book now. I can't do it. And the phone rings, and Thomas answers, and it's Larry Gagosian, who was just sort of starting to become a more established art dealer, asking if Thomas had any Warhols for sale. And I said, oh God, the art world is so ruthless and vicious. And I mean, couldn't he at least wait 24 hours to call you Thomas? Because Thomas was also very close to Andy. The phone rings again, and Thomas says, it's for you. And it was Tina Brown from Vanity Fair saying, I need 5,000 words on what it was like to work with Andy by Monday morning. And Thomas said, oh, journalism, they're really nice in the journalistic world too, right? But, you know, I was grateful for Tina, in retrospect, doing that, because I realized I could write about Andy in a way that was accurate, that was not judgmental. I've tried to do that with all my writing. Tell the good and the bad, but not what I don't like, and I think a lot of people don't like about the press for a long time, is the press sets itself up as the judge and the jury of everybody. We in the press act like we never smoked pot, we never said something stupid, we never had an affair with someone we shouldn't have an affair with. And, you know, I don't think that's the job of the press. I think the job of the press is to tell the story of who people are. How did Mick Jagger become Mick Jagger, or how did El Cordobés, I mean, someone who I was fascinated with, you know, what was his story? That's what people, but you have to, if someone was divorced 4 times, you can't write, were not divorced 4 times. But you don't have to make it like how horrible that they were divorced. I mean,
of course. From all these memories that you have, because you were from 1970 to 1983, you saw him every week, at least.
No, every day, really.
Every day, okay.
Maybe
no one can tell us more accurate. what is the deepest memory? That's very stupid. I don't know, deepest memory because there's so many.
There's so many. Yeah.
There's so many. How can I ask you that? Well, what is the deepest, something that people should know about? Everybody's fascinated by Andy Warhol because he was an enigma. No, he was shy, but he would say he would only go with his friends.
He was shy, but he was also he was passive, but he could be very aggressive. I mean, he was very, I wouldn't say aggressive. Andy was very determined. You know, he was tough. I mean, he never gave up, and he knew he wanted to be the most famous, like Picasso. He knew he wanted to be super successful. But he then had this sad, you know, there was a very melancholy side. I mean, Andy would say to me sometimes, "Oh, Bob, why are you chasing after this one or that one? You know, you have to become rich and famous, and then you can have anybody." And I would say, Andy, I was never a yes man with Andy. I would say, Andy, you're rich and famous, and you're still like unhappy in your love life. So, you know, I mean, and he'd let me get away with that. I mean,
He lost his temper.
he very rarely lost his temper. He liked to provoke other people to use their temper. I mean, a story that I've told, because it's typical. We had Diana Ross on the cover of Interview. And she also had, again, this synergy thing. She had her portraits done, her children's portraits done. The bill was $110,000. I asked her, where do we send the invoice? She said, I don't believe in invoices. I want to write a check right now. And she sat down at the Art Deco desk and wrote a check for $110,000. So we put her on the cover of Interview, and it sold really well. And Andy asked me, how did it sell? I said, it was our best seller so far. So Andy says, oh, Bob, I have a great idea. We should put a black on the cover every month. So I said, this is the repetition. I said, Andy, that's not a good idea. You know, we have like a young black guy one month, like the next month we have Deanna Vreeland, an old white lady, you know, then we have someone from rock and roll, then we have someone from politics. We have to keep surprising people with who would Interview put on next. No, he said, Bob, you just told me Diana Ross was the bestseller. No, let's get Michael Jackson, then we'll get Donna Summers, then we'll get Aretha Franklin. I'm going, Andy, I'm not putting a black on the cover every month. You know, finally I would have to scream, I'm not putting a black on the cover every month. The next day, Andy would, you know, when his diaries came out after he died, I would read, Bob had a nervous breakdown, and he's such a racist because he didn't want to put a black on a cover every month. You know, it was like he was almost provoking the scene so he could tell Pat Hackett that to put in his diary. There was a childlike side of Andy, but, you know, some people, when this book of mine, Holy Terror, came out, they said, did you write it to get revenge on Andy? I said, no, I really did not do that. I wanted to, I said, ultimately, when I read the book myself, after a few years, I realized that I felt sorry for Andy more than anything else. And I think all of those of us who were very close to him, Vincent Fremont, Fred, Bridget, we all felt very protective of him. He had been shot. He was awkward. He needed someone like me or Fred to go to parties with him. You know, Andy would say to like a lady like Nan Kempner, oh gee, Nan, oh, this is so great. And I would say, oh, Andy told me he loves your house, he loves your daughter, he loves your dog. Like we would fill in the blanks for him. But mainly we were protecting him, and you felt like you knew he was strong, but at the same time you wanted to do everything for him because you felt like he needed that help. It wasn't even to please him, it was more to take care of him. And I think deep down, Andy was a very sad person. And I think you see, he was a very, very sensitive person. And I think you see in the work, you know, Andy never, I watched him mix colors. And other critics pointed this out. He never made a yellow that was yellow, or a pink that was like pastel pink, baby pink. He always put black in the paint. Even for a light blue or a bright orange, there was black underneath it. That's why I love your title. There was darkness underneath the brightness, underneath the sweet. The colors were not sweet. At first glance, you thought they were sweet. They weren't sweet. They were deep. And Andy, Fred, you said we were deeply superficial. Andy was a very, very deep person. But Andy, he could not have produced this body of work that you see. But he was cool. Andy was not going to sit around and explain his work to anybody. He wouldn't even hang his own work in his house. That wasn't cool, you know? So he pretended, oh, gee, I don't know why I paint. Why did I paint Mao with the green face, Bob? Bridget, what? You know, he would turn the interviews over to us. And I'd say, I think you ran out of green paint. Oh, right, I ran out of any other color paint. And, you know, the press would like get a sort of laugh, but also be annoyed that he wouldn't level with them. But he thought it was like, he just thought it wasn't cool. He wanted to be one of the cool kids, because he really wasn't when he was growing up. But there was something so touching about Andy. Andy started doing drawings. His brothers told me he grew up in a very, you know, tough Slavic immigrant neighborhood, Polish immigrants, Hungarian immigrants, very, you know, working class and poor in the Depression. And, you know, the kids were pretty tough. And Andy was sickly, he was effeminate, and, you know, that was not easy. And the way he would win these boys over, the neighborhood toughs, his brothers told me, is he would ask to draw them. And they would come in the house in the living room, and he would do a drawing of them. And nothing is more flattering than to have your portrait done by hand. I mean, a photograph is a photograph, but when someone actually is gazing at you for like an hour, and then they turn the thing over and show it to you, and it's you, it's like a miracle, you know. And it's like it's almost, the idea that this is how Andy's art started, you know, again, is so touching.
And I want to ask you something. When people died, we're gone from this world, but when Andy died, that reaction, the absence from the art world, people were in shock. People couldn't believe it. In 3 years, his works of art were going up, down, but forget financially. Among all the artistic community, how was that absence felt? It was such a sad moment.
Well, I mean, you know, it went from like MoMA finally giving him a retrospective, maybe almost out of guilt, to Basquiat, who was really attached to Andy and not being able to deal anymore and going over the line with his addictions and dying a year later. I think a lot of people felt a real emptiness, people who were close to him, but I think the art world at large, it was an unbelievable reaction. I remember there was an old movie star called Paulette Goddard who was married to Charlie Chaplin, and Eric Maria Remarque. Anyway, she and Andy and we all became friends somehow in New York.
House up on Long Island, no?
Paulette, no, she lived in Switzerland on Lago Maggiore.
Did she visit you in the house in
Montauk?
Montauk?
Yes, she came out there. She did a lot of things with Andy and me and all of us. And Andy loved the idea of having Charlie Chaplin's ex-wife as his like date for movie. And she always would wear white fur and lots of diamonds. But she was in Switzerland when Andy died, and she called me and she said, "Oh, Bob, you must be so proud. Look at the coverage Andy's giving." She said, "You know, every newspaper in Germany, every newspaper in Europe, Le Monde, the Zurich newspaper, the Hamburg newspaper, Milan, Corriere della Sera, every has Andy on the front page." And she said, "You were part, you know, you helped him get him there," which was an exaggeration. But she said, "You know," she said, "Andy was one of the three greats. There was Jesus, there was Charlie, and there was Andy." And I thought he would have loved that. But, I mean, he had this impact on the world, on individuals and on the world at large. And it's just amazing, this little boy from Pittsburgh. And I probably said enough.
Well, I don't know. It was an hour interview. I don't know if someone has questions and answers. I don't know. But it's my first time in my life that I do this. I don't know how I did it.
Honored.
No, not in my entire life, but I never.
I think you're a good interviewer, isn't he?
Should I get a TV show after this? Thank you so much. But here, there's people want to.
Thank you. I don't have so much a question as I do a sort of observation, because Andy died so suddenly that a lot of people talk about his late work and about his late career, not as good as his early career and so forth. But really, wasn't he in strong mid-career, still a very young man, was he 58? And doing great work. I had the luck to do, I think, his last show before he died. I was a young dealer in Los Angeles. Now I'm an old dealer in Los Angeles, but and I did Campbell's soup boxes. And we did all these boxes, and we did them out there. And that was in November, December of '86. When he died, and just like you were saying before, I started to get all these phone calls in the morning. Do you have any of those boxes? How much are they? And I had to do my business. By the end of the day, they had gone up 10 times.
Wow.
But his work was, now in retrospect, and we see this today, that the 1980s works are just, there are many that are incredibly strong because they're not late. This is not late Titian. This is mid-career Warhol.
Yeah, it's in his prime. Well, The Last Supper is his last show in Milan in February 1987, and shown in a church. I'm shown in a palazzo opposite the church where Leonardo's Last Supper is. And I think Andy maybe could feel that the end was coming because he had this gallbladder problem that he could not put off dealing with anymore. And he always said if he went to a hospital again after he was shot, that he would die. He would never even visit a friend in a hospital. And on the other hand, Andy was a person who would repeat the same thing every day for 100 days, like the same thing for lunch. And on day 101, say to his assistant, "Why did you bring me a tuna fish sandwich? I don't want a tuna fish sandwich." He said, "Because he had it 100 days in a row." And I remember a conversation with Fred Hughes and Andy. We were on some trip and we were having dinner. And Fred said, "Andy, at some point, I think you have to give up this pop thing. And, I think it's time for a big change. I think you should go live on a mountain in Switzerland, like Nietzsche and Giacometti. Go to Sils Maria." I remember, and do spiritual paintings. And Andy was like, "Oh, gee, maybe that's a good idea." But there was, I think, you never know. I mean, Andy was he was particularly sad in the last year or two of his life because Jed Johnson had left him. This new boyfriend died of AIDS. The whole Basquiat thing was very confusing for him. So he might not, maybe it was his time to go, but you're right, he wasn't in his 80s, and to call it late work is a little, it's a misnomer.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. What an honor to have you here in Mexico City. And thank you. And we have to do another one 3 hours long because there's many, many, many stories that you can tell us. Thank you.
I'm very honored that I'm your first interview subject of the new Eugenio López TV show. And thank you all for being here.